So much, Anne. And
Thank
welcome,
you.
everyone, to the Regional Education Laboratory Northeast Islands Forum for Collaborative Research. This is our fourth forum where we've gathered people who are interested in talking and sharing and learning more about research partnerships between practitioners and researchers and people interested in the education field. So we're so excited to have you here this afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are. Um, Just a quick walkthrough of the agenda. We're going to hear from two different research practitioner partnerships today. The first we're going to hear about is the Research and Practice Collaboratory. Pamela Buffington is one of the co-PIs on that project, is going to give us an overview of that project. And then we're going to hear from Julie Reardon and Marco Andrade talking about an IES Researcher Practitioner Partnership project based in Providence, Rhode Island. And then we're going to have a moderated discussion about some of the key features that characterize partnerships. And we're going to bring in one of REL Northeast Islands leads on research alliances, Maria Paz Avery, also known as MP Avery, to talk with Julie and Marco and Pam and others about these key features. And we would welcome your participation actively in the online chat. We'll pull your questions over and ask presenters as we go and during the moderated discussion. So just as a little bit of context, why are we leading this forum on collaborative research partnerships? And as many of you know, one of our charges as the Regional Education Laboratory System is to provide research support to the regions through what we call, in our program, research alliances. And across the 10 RELs, there are 79 distinct research alliances. And each one, they're unique in the content that they study, in the people that they involve, in the jurisdictions that they serve. Some are embedded in State Departments, some are cross-jurisdictional. So we have a lot of different models to look at in this program, and we are very anxious to make sure that we all get the chance to share this rich body of information. The pieces that we all do share across the regional education laboratories is that all the researchers and practitioners are coming together around a shared issue or problem of practice, and that everyone is bringing their expertise to the table to work on these issues to ultimately help improve student outcomes and learning. So just very specific about the Northeastern Islands, Anne already went over this, but we do have 8 research alliances in our region. And each one of these has its own structure. Even within our own alliance, even within our own laboratory, we have all different types of alliances. Some are distinct to one jurisdiction, some are cross, some focus with district people, some focus with state. So it really can be unique and look different in different ways. As you probably are aware, there is an emerging literature on this, on what makes an effective collaborative research partnership, and with whatever name that you're using to call it. But one of the ones that we sort of keep pulling back to is the research done by Coburn and others, that these are the 5 key features that are really important to have in place for an effective research partnership. Long-term, meaning more than just one project or one little grant that you have, that they focus on authentic problems of practice that are sort of co-designed, that they're committed to mutualism, meaning that there are benefits for all the parties that are involved, that the strategies that you use to promote and foster partnership are intentional. You're putting them in place. They're not just sort of happening. And then at the end of the day, you're producing original research. This, we think, really mirrors the work of the REL programs, and hoping that, and it also mirrors the work that you're going to hear about today. And today we're going to be focusing mostly on 3 and 4. You'll hear a little bit about the other features as well, but mostly we're going to look at 3 and 4. Now, we wanted to just get a sense of the people that are in the room, so we're going to do a little bit of a poll to see if you are, the work that you're doing that is a research partnership, it has all these 5 features. And then something else we'd like to think about, and please pick all that apply in that first question. And then the second feature is you can only pick one, and where do you think you're expending the most energy? Is it about maintaining the structure, developing the analyses, focusing on mutualism, the intentional strategies? We just want to get a sense of what is sort of taking up the most of your time. We'll leave this poll open for a little bit. It looks like most of the work that you all are doing has all 5 features, with the most focusing on problems of practice. That's good to see. So it looks like most folks are focusing on, Jenny, did we have to publish the poll? Or is it already published? Is everyone seeing this? I'm sorry. Oh, great. Okay. And it looks like the place that people are sort of equally split on spending the most amount of their time is defining and refining the problems of practice, which rings true to us at RELNE, and also on developing the intentional strategies to foster partnership. I think we all would agree on the phone today. It takes a lot of time to foster partnership, so it's going to be great to share experiences about how this works. Okay, Jenny, should we close the poll? Thank you. I'm usually in a room with a lot of people, but today I'm in a hotel room in California, so I'm a bit at sea. I thank you all for your patience. So just quickly again, the goals for today, get an overview of these 2 research practitioner partnerships in the Northeast, share the benefits of and challenges to mutualism, and to share some intentional strategies to promote partnerships and address challenges that come up to promoting those kinds of partnerships. So while you're listening, we really want to encourage you to share your ideas and thoughts in the chat. You'll see some people are introducing themselves in the chat. We love that. As you have questions as the presenters talk, please add them here, or your own stories to share, your good success strategies, et cetera. We will try to answer them in the Q&A periods. And be thinking about your own work as we focus in on today's presentation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Pam Buffington, who's one of the co-PIs from EDC on the Research and Practice Collaboratory. Pam?
Hi, welcome folks. Good afternoon. I'm going to give you an overview of the Research and Practice Collaboratory. It's an NSF-funded collaborative project designed to bridge the gap between educational research and practice in the STEM areas. We actually are a co-laboratory. We have multiple different partners across the country, ranging from an informal site, which is the Exploratorium, where the PI for this particular project resides. We have a site at EDC, which is what I'm going to primarily talk about today. We have partners at the University of Colorado Boulder, University of Washington, Seattle, Inverness Research, and SRI International. The site in Washington is really focusing in on science and engineering practices. Our site is focused on math and technology, and we have researchers that are looking at that. Bill Penuel at the University of Colorado Boulder is focusing in on early researchers and really engaging in research practice partnerships. We're using a 3-pronged approach within this work. We know that we need to expand access to documentation and events such as this that allow folks to understand more fully how to engage in the kinds of partnerships that leverage the deep knowledge that practitioners have, as well as the knowledge of researchers. There is a critical engagement component, really focused in on changing strategies, perceptions, and beliefs around the communication and the ways in which we work together. And then there are opportunities for collaboration and adaptation. And I will talk about our adaptation site. Essentially, it is taking these ideas about research and practice and putting them into practice in an actual site, and our site is a district. We are implementing a design-based implementation research approach where we bring together practitioners and researchers to work collaboratively around a persistent problem of practice. We are committed to engaging around iterative collaborative design. We have teams that develop theory based on what we're learning through systemic inquiry, and we develop and extend capacity of all parties over time. The particular context, as I began talking about it, is focusing in on math and mobile technologies. We're working within a district that has an improvement effort focused on implementing iPads for K through 3 teachers and students, all students at that age, and we are focusing in on how to best use those mobile technologies to support mathematics learning and teaching. We also bring together, and we already have brought together, researchers from across the country that focus in on early math learning, use of interactive technologies, and mathematics, along with practitioners working in these areas to actually come up with some key design principles for that work. Our long-range plans are to identify adaptation problems faced by stakeholders and work within the adaptation sites so that we can contribute to ongoing research agendas. We also identify proper resources and tools to meet the needs and interests of stakeholders, and that's both researcher stakeholders and practitioner stakeholders. We document the adaptation process to help provide insights into sustainability and scaling strategies over time, and we create new networks and capacities among researchers and practitioners maintained after the project ends. And when I talk about practitioners, in our particular case, we're talking about district level leadership, superintendent, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, as well as specialists. We have a technology integration specialist for the elementary schools involved, a math coach, as well as principals from our targeted schools and teachers that are teaching within those classrooms in those schools. So that's what I mean by practitioners. Researchers, we actually have researchers from EDC, myself included, as well as math education researchers from 2 universities. The challenges that we're facing in our work really are cultural, conceptual, and practical, and this is true across the collaboratory sites. We know that there are seemingly different views on the most important questions around STEM education, the most appropriate methods, and how to interpret the results. Other challenges include that the research and practice have distinct and often different vernacular. In other words, we speak in different languages in many cases, and so we have to decode those critical acronyms and other language within our work. We often have different timelines, different descriptions of problems of practice to be investigated. In the case of our site, we came to agreement at the very beginning, before we defined the problems of practice more clearly, that it would be in the area of mathematics. It would be specifically at the grades pre-K through 2, and that we would focus in on the use of technology. But we really had to dig into the problems of practice to be investigated. The lessons learned to this point are that developing jointly negotiated research requires building trust and shared language. That has to come up front. It really helps to deepen the work and have the work be sustainable. Building relationships takes time. Outlining commitments and collaborative roles of all parties is essential. This, in our case, we started right with the memo of understanding to define what those roles were and the commitments of all parties, the researchers, the practitioners, those of us that wore both hats. And it was extremely useful for us in our work to have a facilitator to bridge the research practice gap. The best case is to have a boundary crosser, someone who can do or have lived in both of those spaces. It's working extremely well for us to be able to interpret and bridge those different languages and different cultures. As I mentioned before, co-investigation is a cultural change for both research and practice. We have to break down prior stereotypes and misconceptions about practitioners and researchers and build the relationships together. Establishing a true culture of collaboration means attention to equity and voice throughout the research investigation process, including during problem identification, study design, data collection, and analysis interpretation of results. In other words, we need to make sure that practitioners have equitable voice in study design and also in the problem identification. Oftentimes there will be a particular focus of either the researcher or the practitioner in different aspects of this research and investigation process. And in this case, it really is a constant revisiting among all parties at each stage in the process.
Thanks so much, Pam. Oh, sorry. This is Rebby.
I was going to say, at this point, I will take questions. So, Rebby, what were you going to say?
I was going to say we have one question from Shelby, who asked, how would the challenges, especially the POP, which I'm assuming is problem of practice, reconciled among the partners?
I think that that's a very difficult and sometimes delicate process because as maybe a keen eye in terms of the mathematics expertise or somebody who has deep knowledge of technology integration might see a problem that someone that has an untrained eye in that area may not see. So you really want to make sure that we don't set up situations where there's an expert that's judging or that there's a practitioner that comes to the table thinking that you can't understand the context. So all of those things have to really be negotiated in a way. And I think that's why, in our particular case, having someone that's been in both environments has been very useful because you can have conversations among some design team members. In our case, we have some of the leadership and a set number from each position being able to say, we're seeing this particular situation in the classroom. Can you explain it more deeply? And then have the administrators and so on be in that party. And yet, the point that Shelby made there is there a space for a facilitator? Absolutely, because we want to make sure that all voices are heard. And right at the beginning, during this identification of the problem of practice, you could shut down the whole process if you don't have someone who's very sensitive to voice and language and power even, power and privilege in those settings. So using a facilitator and a boundary crosser has worked very well for us.
That's great. Thanks, Pam. You know, we had a question come from somebody in the registration process, Pam, that was asking about how informal learning experience, so sort of out of the classroom time, like museums or after-school programs, media productions, can they support and be part of the partnership, the collaborative research efforts?
Absolutely. In fact, in this research practice collaboratory, we have the Exploratorium in San Francisco, who is a partner in the research. A colleague of mine is also on this webinar, Molly Shea. She works with informal settings, informal science settings, and they bring together researchers and practitioners on an ongoing basis. A little later on in the webinar, we'll have more time for question and answer, and we can talk more about that. But absolutely, same kind of situation exists there. And in fact, they have been working on a facilitation guide for equity to make sure there's equitable conversation and facilitation in their informal sites to make sure that the parents, the community members, the researchers, the facilitators all have equal voice in their work together. So absolutely.
Okay, great. I don't see any more questions in the chat right now, but I encourage you all, if something pops into your brain, to add it there and we can address it later. And now I'm going to turn it over to Julie Reardon and Marco Andrade to talk about the work in Providence. Julie?
Great, thanks, Ruby. The partnership between EDC and Providence Public Schools is intended to support the development and implementation of a research agenda for the district. As part of the work of the partnership, though, we're also facilitating the development of a broader consortium of organizations in Providence, one that includes institutions of higher education and community organizations that will contribute to this agenda and the work of it. We call this group the Providence Education Research Consortium, or PERC short. The work that we have done initially, that's just between EDC and Providence Public Schools, has focused on the population of English learner students in the district as a high priority area of interest. And I think I'll turn this over to Marco next to talk about the genesis of our collaboration and then some specifics about our partnership. So Marco, I'm going to advance the slide here.
Great. Thanks, Julie.
Take it over. Yep.
So, hi, folks. I'm Marco Andrade. I'm from the Providence School Department. I'm actually the director for the Office of Research Planning and Accountability. And back in March, June of 2011, we had actually invited the Council of Great City Schools to come in and do an audit of our L programming. And basically, we'd give them a lot of data, and they provide a report for us on in September of 2012. It listed about 79 recommendations, which we present to our school board, and it even included a whole section on an improved data collection and an evaluation, things that we should be doing, could be doing. So certainly at the time, there was a focus on improving our L services here in Providence. And when the researcher practitioner grant came along, it seemed like a pretty good opportunity for us because we had actually had some prior experience or relationship with the REL. We had requested their help with some research. Also a member of the Urban School Improvement Alliance, and basically based on those relationships, we'd had some communication. So it seemed like a pretty good opportunity for us to work together and try to do something a little bit more jointly than we had done in the past.
Great. I'm going to advance to the next slide.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yep.
So in terms of the work and what we're hoping to be able to accomplish, I think there's a couple of things. On one level, it is strengthening the relationship between Providence Public Schools and the EDC, the REL, and so this grant is an opportunity for us to be able to do that. You can see the second bullet talking about taking advantage of complementary skills to build synergies between the practitioner and researcher. That has been something that we've been able to do through this process, and we certainly, in applying for the grant, saw this as one of those opportunities to kind of come together and have our complementary skills play and feed off one another, so we can try to get some of the issues and concerns we had about our L programming, researched, and try to get some information that can help us out in improving those services. It's also, though, in terms of working with others in our community more locally. So, facilitating collaborative research between PPSD and other researchers. Some of this work, it's about helping to set up a research agenda and trying to build that research consortium, which Julia just mentioned, that PERC. And so some of these other things tie in with that, trying to leverage those local resources here and get the folks more in Providence or in Rhode Island to help us out in answering some of the questions, because we certainly have quite a few to answer around L programming. And then, of course, the mechanisms to translate the research into action is important. Having had experiences with researchers, typically folks just want to use us as a site to recruit for their studies, and then they're gone. We don't always get reports that are useful, meaningful, and so we're looking to create a legitimate partnership with folks that leads to information that can help us with policy changes, practice, programming, et cetera.
Thanks, Marco. I just put a footnote to that slide and to say that, as Marco and I and the bigger group have met, we have reflected a couple of times that it's just hard to imagine that this kind of research doesn't occur like this all the time, because you really do need this partnership of district and local or state contextual knowledge and information about the data, and then also the capacity that the research side brings. So just wanted to emphasize that point, and I'm going to advance to the next slide for you, Marco.
So in terms of some of the structures that we've established, again, I'm going to split this into two different things. We have our meeting structures to be able to execute the grant. So we've set up the biweekly research team meetings, the monthly PI meetings, and these quarterly core planning group meetings, and all of these things help keep us focused on the grant itself and making sure that we're moving along with the things that we had said we want to do. There's also the work that we are, it's kind of a work in progress and we're continuing to work towards, but the flexible charter, these district roundtables. So for example, internally in PPSD, we need to make sure that the voice of central office staff and others are being heard in terms of setting that research agenda. So one of the things that we're working towards is having these, maybe 2 times a year, these district roundtables where folks have an opportunity to basically take a look at the research agenda, vet it, ask questions, clarifications, say that these are some emerging issues, and so on, so that we can continually get their voice in that agenda setting process. And also looking to set up the advisory panel so that when we're working with or getting advice from experts, local experts at institutions of higher education, other partners, that these folks are basically available to us to meet regularly and to help in answering some of the questions that are being identified through the agenda setting process.
Great. All right, and so on this slide, we've listed just some of our project activities. You can see there are a range of activities, including those that are designed to monitor and manage some of these external requests for research that Marco mentioned. And then other activities that are more focused around planning for and conducting research. And so in the Department of Monitoring and Managing, we have a database that we're working to create that will keep the requests and information about the requests in terms of who's requesting, what kind of data are being requested, for what purpose, and then as a way to close the loop on these, to also indicate when final reports are submitted to the district. And this will go hand in hand with an application that would be used for external researchers. In terms of the research itself, we've bolded the research agenda workshop. I'll spend a few minutes on the next slide talking about that. But we have engaged in a catalog already of data elements that are necessary for the initial analyses that were focused on our English language students, and begun descriptive analyses. The research agenda workshop was designed to engage not just our core planning group, so Marco, myself, and then other key personnel from EDC and Providence, but also the superintendent and other leaders in the central office to identify questions of interest for the district. So on this slide, we show the various steps that were involved in the workshop. It started with a list of 10 already identified high priority areas, and then an opportunity for district staff to discuss these both topic areas and research questions associated with the topic areas, and not only have an opportunity to talk in small groups with each other in role-alike groups, but also to have a larger group discussion on it, and then ultimately to vote on the areas of greatest importance for the district. And so I think one of the things that Marco and I saw as a key outcome from this workshop, in addition to having identified 3 areas, which I'll tell you in a moment what they are, but just the idea that you have a buy-in from district staff leadership and an opportunity for them to express their views on the kind of research the district ought to be doing. And I know that it took just a lot of planning and going back and forth to make sure we'd get a date that everyone could go, and it was very well attended, and folks stayed for the entire meeting, which was, again, I think a good outcome in terms of stakeholder buy-in. And the 3 areas that were surfaced were college and career readiness, and educator effectiveness, and English language learners. Marco, is there anything else to add about that workshop?
No, well, actually, I just wanted to mention, you already touched on it, was just simply like my concern from being within a district, whether or not this this agenda-setting workshop, uh, what kind of buy-in there would be from central office folks. It was something novel. We hadn't done this before. And Julie can attest to this, I was worried about how this was going to be received, but everybody made it, and it was, we had a lot of good feedback from folks. They appreciated the opportunity to be heard. They enjoyed the process and enjoyed being able to contribute to setting that agenda. So I think all in all, it was very good, and they were looking forward to the next opportunity to sit down and look at the revised research questions that we were going to be working on.
All right. So the next couple of slides, we're talking about challenges and opportunities and some lessons learned. So you'll see on the slide here, we've categorized these challenges mostly around 3 big areas. And I would say they probably go in order in terms of how we encountered them. There are issues around data collection. In the case of our collaboration, we are using district-level data, but we also needed data from the state. And so it doesn't, you could probably take the word state out and insert some other organization, but whenever you're coordinating a data collection effort, that, you have to wait on another organization, for whom your request is not a top priority. And so there is time and effort involved in that. I think one thing that we've had to say out loud a few times is that we expect, that there's going to be messiness in the data. So, as researchers, we, expect that there's missing data or miscoded data or, any number of issues that may happen with data. And so what happens in a collaboration like this is when you partner, when you marry the folks who know the data so well and those who are, using the data, you actually get the full story. Sort of can almost look at every cell of the data to understand what that is. So there's a temptation, I think, there's an opportunity, to want to explain the anomalies of the data, but also a temptation to go ahead and fix every last cell. And so there's a balance there, I think, between trying to explain those anomalies or those outliers and then accepting that there's going to be some that you can't and that you don't want to go back. Let's see if there's anything else to say on the data collection. Oh, that, as we go through this, there are, the revelation that sometimes you're going to need more data than you thought. And we had one good opportunity. It was fortuitous that Providence was in the midst of launching a new student information system, and we were able to very quickly meet shortly after we got the grant to discuss what those additional data elements might be, and then put them into the new student information system. So that was a good kind of opportunity. So the second category is competing demands. Just challenging to find time for, mostly for district staff. I think everyone's busy, but the researchers on our end, since we have time specifically allocated to the project, we can help drive the work, but we don't have all of that contextual information, which is so important, whether it's information about the data or the relationships in the district, with those, again, from the central staff. And then finally, just grappling with the questions about, how, practitioners are getting the feedback they want, and sort of where do you draw the line between which practitioners are part of the group and which are not. Marco, did you want to?
I just want to mention that second bullet. Just from being within the district, I can tell you that I think one of the threats is for us, any given day, there's some kind of priority or emergency happening. There's a fire to put out. So there's so many things happening that it does become challenging to be able to dedicate that time to really focus in on this work the way you want to. So I think just anybody working with the district, it's just something to keep in mind. I'm probably already aware of it, but just in case you're not, it's definitely, I think it's an ongoing issue. It's something that, again, it could be a threat, but I think fortunately the structures that we've set up have helped because we've got that kind of that time set aside, and we know we're going to meet, and it's been working out. So thanks. Thanks, Julie.
And so just quickly, some lessons learned. The collaboration, we think is important for the relevance piece of the work, and also keeping it rigorous with having enough capacity to do the work. Meeting regularly is important to building trust and collegiality in the partnership. One thing that we've done is engage in pre-work sessions to prepare for meetings. So the EDC team will meet and we'll draft an agenda, for example, and then share with the group. So we try to do some of the work to make it sort of lessen that burden on the district. This widespread collaboration, I think, is important, in terms of getting the wider district stakeholder buy-in, but also can result in some uncertainty and lack of control. So at the research agenda workshop, for example, we already knew that we were going to focus on English language learners. I mean, that was the focus of the grant. So we had talked about taking that off as a topic because we knew we really wanted to focus on it. But we threw it in there and said, well, let's just make sure this is what everybody in the district is interested in. Fortunately, it was. Marco, is there anything else you wanted to add there?
No, thanks, Julie. I'm all set.
All right, I'm going to think it might give time for a short question or two.
Yep. Hi, Julie. We don't have questions in the chat, although I'm going to give people a to look at that. I was wondering if you two could talk quickly about sort of the transparency of the work you're doing now, sort of in early days. Are you, does everyone in the district know what's happening? Is it a closed group? And sort of how do you maintain that balance?
Well, why don't I start, Marco, and you can jump in. I would say that the research agenda workshop is where we really had full district knowledge, buy-in, understanding, because not only did we do this research agenda workshop, but we described all the aspects of the grant, the goals, where we're headed. So there's that. Marco, is there something else to say about the way that's transitioned from start to now?
No, and that's true. And then I think since that time, though, we've been meeting more as that core planning group, looking at the analyses that were done, discussing those, and just doing some of that planning work. So one of the next steps was, building that report, and then how we're going to report back to to those central office folks who had participated initially in the research agenda setting workshop. So we're not quite at that end yet. I feel like we're still in process and trying to work some of the things out. And then soon we'll be going back to them so they can hear what's kind of where we're at, what's going on.
Right, I remember. We actually have a core planning group meeting tomorrow, and so one of the questions is we have a pretty lengthy technical report we've produced, and the question is, okay, so which part of this is what we want to share with the rest of the folks in the central office, mostly in terms of scope and again keeping people in the loop.
And format and context, et cetera, just making sure that we think through how things might be received and being cautious about, results from this initial analysis and making sure folks don't just start making knee-jerk reactions or policy decisions, et cetera, but that we're talking about it, thinking about it, and continuing on from here. And as Julie mentioned, trying to think about future grant opportunities and kind of digging deeper into the data to look at our REL programming.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to ask someone to advance the slide for me because I lost my presenter status for a moment. Thank you for doing that. So I want to reintroduce you to someone I mentioned earlier, Maria Paz Avery, MP Avery, who is the Research Alliance lead for Northeastern Islands. We're going to invite Pam and Julie and Marco to join us in a couple of different conversations that really focus back on to the idea of mutualism and these intentional strategies. And I would really invite you all to share your questions and strategies and answers to these questions that you have in the online chat, because we'd love to be able to share broadly with everyone that is sort of engaging in or thinking about this work. So I'm gonna lob this first question to you, MP, and it's about mutualism. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether you made the decision to be explicit about how the work in the REL Research Alliances were going to be beneficial to all parties, or did you keep it as more of an implied, subtext? And how did you come to that decision?
Hi, yes, hi, everyone. Regarding your question, Rebbe, we've been very explicit in focusing on mutualism from the very beginning of our research alliances, and that really happened at the very beginning through the research setting agenda workshops that you've been hearing so much about. But we conducted the research setting agendas with each of our core planning group members of our alliances. So our alliances each has a core planning group that's made up of mostly practitioners from either the state departments of education, other state agencies, districts, schools. It really depends on the nature of the alliance itself, the topic, as well as the specific focus. But every alliance that we had went through a research setting agenda workshop, and that was really key because the questions that were being asked about problems of practice, what we were finding in these research agenda workshops was that the members of our core planning group would be bringing up problems of practice, things that were very much on their minds in their day-to-day work. Often, though, what we had to do was really go through an iterative process of working with those problems of practice and developing them into researchable questions. So that was the interaction that was very important at the beginning and really helped establish that idea with our core planning group members that we were there. We, and by we I mean the alliance teams from the RELNI, to really try to get at this idea that we were there for mutual benefit. So this was an explicit strategy that we entered into because we were committed to developing bodies of work that were relevant to the work of our alliance members and that would have direct implications for policy or practice, but at the same time, and for those researchers on our teams, at the same time contribute to more general understanding and knowledge about key issues in education, which is something that researchers are always concerned about. So that iterative process was really very important. What was interesting, though, was that very often our researcher practitioner roles would overlap, so that, in other words, for example, who was a practitioner and who was a researcher was not always distinct. So our alliance teams, for example, the RELNA staff, consisted of a facilitator and a researcher, both of whom often had experience as both practitioners, having either worked as in schools or in districts, or had provided a lot of technical assistance at the state, district, and school levels. And we had, and our researchers also had those kind of experiences, and our facilitators had research experience. And so we were really able to bridge those two perspectives and help think through what the problem of practice was and what the appropriate research questions were. At the same time, I think many of our alliance members are what we would normally think of as practitioners, that is, people who are grounded in the workings of a Department of Education, a district, a school, or a classroom, but who also had roots as researchers and who in their current positions might not have the time or resources to conduct original research as part of their work. So you've heard from Marco Andrade, who is with Providence Public Schools, and he is both someone who is a researcher and understands research, but is really very immersed right now in the day-to-day work of a district. So we were lucky in that we had people like that, and we could keep each other honest, I think, in terms of really seeing whether the questions that we were addressing, the projects that we were engaged in, would have benefit for both the practitioners and the researchers. So another way that we maintained this mutualism was through the periodic reviews of our research agenda with our CPG members. And so this joint iterative development of specific research topics and questions would help ensure that there was relevance and applicability for our practitioners, but also met standards of rigor that our researchers were really concerned about. So I know we've been repeating a lot about the research setting agenda workshops, but I think they have been critical in really building that trust and understanding across both parties around what research would benefit both the practitioners and the researchers.
That's great, MP. Thank you. And Pam, I'm going to turn to you to ask you the same question. So, were you up at the upfront very explicit about what benefits could be gleaned from all sides?
Absolutely. The mutualism is explicit and has been from the recruiting process. When we reached out to the higher ed partners as well as the district to work with, we were really clear that this would be a collaborative process and that we are not coming to the work with a particular problem already in mind or a research question in mind. We did know with the particular district that they had interest in understanding more deeply what was going on in their early elementary classrooms, where they did have an initiative in place, but they didn't know what the problem or problems were that they wanted to engage with. So even in the, as I mentioned earlier, in the setting of the memo of agreement, we outlined that each of us would contribute and what roles we would have in that process. And at each stage of the work, as we reiterated the design, engaged in the identification of the problem of practice and so on, oftentimes particular participants would say, and so what are we going to do next? And we would have to say, well, it depends on what we collectively decide. How do we want to dig into this? Which particular research question are we going to dig into? How do we want to set it up? Even in the early stages about identifying the particular schools that were going to be involved, it was very much a process in which the district design team and the design partners from our organization and the higher ed partners all had to come together. And that process of uncovering the persistent problems really was generative. And it continues as we're doing iterative stages of refinement and data collection and so on. So definitely explicit.
Great, thanks. Pam, can you talk a little bit more about some examples of what benefits you've been finding, either on the researcher side or on the practitioner side? What have people sort of gotten out of this experience so far that they could go back and tell others about?
Well, for one thing, the topic, when you have an innovative topic, like in this case, the use of mobile technologies for early learning, this is really in its infancy. In particular, other areas of technology is an emerging field over time, but the practitioners who've been engaged in this for the last couple of years really have a lot to say to researchers about what they're finding out in practice. So there are lots of contributions, and the researchers involved have been really engaged and interested in something they don't know. And then the continued needs of the practitioners as they're doing the work and trying strategies in their classroom, the research knowledge and the other knowledge that's being brought to bear has been really beneficial. As teachers are discovering they need to understand more about a topic to research it more fully, they will ask particular questions, and the professional learning environment that's involved in this particular initiative can be refined and tweaked and enhanced based on what the needs are of the practitioners. So I think that it's really critical that that both are gaining, and in this particular case too with higher ed, math educators are really gaining a lot from the relationship with practitioners in the field.
Thanks. Julie or Marco, do you want to talk a little bit about any tangible benefits that you've seen so far in these early days?
This is Marco. I can mention, I think in terms of the work itself, certainly as a district, we know what we needed we know what we want to learn. We had the questions. We knew what information we needed to be able to make informed decisions. But we didn't necessarily have that capacity to just dive in and do this kind of analysis. So I think it ties in with the mutualism a little bit, the synergy between us and the REL, that with that partner, we had that individual, that group that actually had that expertise and was in a position that they could bring that to bear. So, so certainly the benefit for us, obviously, is that we're getting the help that we need to answer the questions that have been identified as being very important to us. And we also have a partner now that can help us not only answer those questions, but think through what might be appropriate next steps, actions, et cetera, particularly, again, as we start planning for another, as one of the upcoming grant cycles. And I think, well, I guess I could let Julie speak for the REL in terms of the benefits for them.
Well, I think just in general, for, at the field of education research, just keeping the work relevant and useful, I think is important. I think, again, it feels like a luxury to have such an in-depth understanding of, the data and the information that we're using. And so I think I'll just leave it at that.
I actually would just want to add one other thing, though, that focus. So in terms of this grant, for example, the REL, they've been very instrumental in helping to kind of prepare things for the meeting and getting these things together so we can sit down and talk. So that structure, they help a lot with that focus. And it really is important because, as I mentioned before, being inside the school system, there's so many things that are competing for our attention, and there's so many issues that are always popping up and surfacing. I think Pam had mentioned one of her slides about different timelines, for example. So, the things that we're dealing with don't necessarily correspond with timelines that other folks might have. And I've heard this from some of the other partners that are not, part of this grant. But it is important to recognize that. So I think that in terms of the work that we're doing, that's been a very good thing for us, a very good thing for the work, and something that if it wasn't present, if that feature, that aspect, the role that the EDC, the REL is playing, if it weren't for that, it would have been very difficult for us to stay focused on this kind of work and really do what would be necessary to answer the questions ourselves.
I think that's very true, Marco. We've heard that from a lot of people, that it's just you're not in control of your own time when you work in a district or a state department. Sometimes you go in thinking you're going to be doing one thing, and by the end of the day, you've done about 50 other things, which I think is one of the big challenges to doing this work. MP, do you see any other challenges to sort of making sure that everybody is getting the most out of this partnership?
Well, I think one of the challenges, and it's been alluded to already, I mean, time is definitely one thing that we have to struggle with all the time, but I also heard Marco allude to, maybe being clear about what the separation of tasks are. So what is it that we expect from the practitioner members of the group, and what is it that we expect from the researchers? And as Marco was saying, sometimes a lot of the additional or behind-the-scenes work is done by the researchers, like those of us on the REL, and then we're careful about where we need the involvement of our core planning group members, at what point, and for what purposes, and really being clear about that so we're not bombarding our practitioner members when they have so many other demands that they have to address. I think the other challenge to the mutualism question has to do with, even though when we understand each other's positions as researchers and practitioners, there's still different perspectives that we bring, and needing to have a shift in those perspectives. So I think from the practitioner side, there's the question of what evidence is good enough for action. It's like, how much do we really need to be able to take some action? That's something that always comes up. And then on the other side, for researchers saying, well, we have to attend to issues of rigor in terms of the research and the collection of the data and the analysis of the data. And so that tension between what's good enough and the urgency for answers that practitioners need, and still maintaining the rigor, I think that's one thing that keeps coming up over and over again.
Thanks, MP. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we allow our panelists and you all in the online chat to talk about sort of what are your key strategies that you have in your toolbox to intentionally promote partnerships? What do you have in that you would just want to pass on to the next generation of folks doing this work, or that you would do the next time you embarked on this? Julie or Marco, do you want to talk about some strategies that you just think we couldn't do this work if we hadn't put the structure in place?
Sure. I think meeting regularly, informally and formally, is key. Formally we have these biweekly team meetings and monthly PI meetings, quarterly CPG, and these biannual district roundtables. So that's important because they're on the calendar and it keeps the work moving. But really, just as important is the ability to pick up the phone and call each other. And then finally, just the ability to talk frankly with each other, about what's feasible, possible, trying to understand, our own organization's context and how they work. So I think those are the structures I think of that come to mind. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Marco.
Yeah, I agree completely.
MP, any things that you just think must be shared?
Well, one of the strategies that has developed organically among our Alliance teams is having recommitment calls with their CPG members every year. This provides an opportunity to review with each member individually what the focus of the Alliance is, but also to do a personal needs assessment around that focus. So what are the issues that are most current for that particular member at that point in time that relates to the research agenda of the Alliance? This is especially important for us because we only have 4 formal meetings a year with our core planning group members. And so these recommitment calls every year play a very key role in promoting that partnership. The other thing, which we've said a number of times, and I think by all the presenters, is that we engage in a yearly review of our Alliance's research agenda. So we're reviewing and revising it on a yearly basis so that we're making sure that we're meeting the needs of our partners on the Alliance, and this helps promote that collaboration. The other thing that we've heard from our members, and in terms of why they've continued their partnership with us through the core planning group membership, is that we've really worked very hard at maintaining flexibility, creativeness, and transparency in responding to the expressed needs of the group as well as individual needs. And I guess we're lucky in the sense that we have a package of services as the REL, and we draw on that package of services so that sometimes we use our reference desk service as a way of meeting some urgent needs for information from our core planning group members, both as a group as well and individually. We also have a number of workshops that we've already developed on a variety of topics, such as the use of data, logic modeling, how to use survey data, et cetera. And so as issues come up for some of our members, we present this to them and say, what would really be a good follow-up to something that you've already done is to get your principals to really look at the logic model in order to articulate what exactly it is that they're doing and why they're doing it and for what ultimate outcomes. The other thing that we use a lot is, and thank you for those of you who are from other RELs, is that we've often called on other RELs and said, so what do you already know about this, or what have you already done here that we could share with our members? So I think those strategies have helped continue the interest in the partnership and the involvement of our core planning group members.
Thank you. And we've just got about a minute left. Are there challenges to building strong partnerships that you've experienced? We've talked a little bit about time demands, time constraints, turnover in districts. Is there anything else or states, anything else you'd want to add?
Well, I wanted to respond actually to Shelby's question about the schools and districts and how they feel if their school and district was identified or could be identified in some way if they were part of a study. And actually, as a facilitator of the English Language Learners Alliance here at RELNI, that happened with one of our studies that our group had supported, and we used the data from one district, and there was a lot of concern about, from that district, that although this was just a descriptive study, it wasn't even a cause and effect kind of study. It was just a descriptive study of of the characteristics of their English language learners and their achievement patterns in terms of English language proficiency as well as on the content assessments. And there was a concern that this was going to be seen as an evaluation of how well the office or the director of English language learner programs in that district, that it would be an evaluation of his work and the programs. But we've actually been able to use that study with non-districts, with districts that were not part of that study, and gotten them to think about what would happen in their own districts. Did they have the same results? Were they different? Why were they different? What would they do if they had data like that? And for that own district, in meeting directly with just the district leadership and not having it be a public meeting, they began to see that there were places where they could improve and began to see the study more as an opportunity for improvement rather than as an evaluation of what they were doing. So although that was a challenge, we were able to turn it around and make it something positive for them.
MP, thank you so much. Pam and Molly, thank you so much. Marco and Julie, thank you so much. And to everybody who attended, I'm sorry we went a moment or two over time, but this was so helpful for us to be able to get your thoughts and questions. Please continue to let us know if you've got any questions or have thoughts on this, and please fill out the evaluation. IES is anxious to know how people are experiencing these events. We appreciate your time, and we hope you join us again soon.